Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to take those really complex strategic ideas and make them practical, things you can actually use. Today, we're tackling something fundamental, maybe even a bit overlooked, that affects, well, almost any group trying to achieve something big: relational breakdown. Our sources highlight this pattern where, promising movements, teams, ministries, they start strong, full of vision, but then they falter. And it's often not the mission itself that fails, it's that the relationships inside just fracture.
That's exactly right. It's like this silent friction that grinds things to a halt, and it doesn't get the strategic attention it really deserves. But what's really interesting in the material we looked at is this shift in perspective. Most conflict, it argues, isn't really about bad intentions or, malice. It usually comes from pretty predictable things. Different viewpoints bumping against each other, expectations people haven't voiced, simple misunderstandings.
So it's less about deliberate sabotage and more just the inevitable messiness of humans working together.
Precisely. And the sources say that right there, in that tension, lies this huge kind of untapped potential. The potential to actually turn conflict into connection, turn misunderstanding into genuine mutual respect. It's stressed pretty heavily that just ignoring these little relational cracks is incredibly costly. In fact, groups that intentionally build skills in reconciliation, that train leaders in handling disagreements constructively, they gain this profound strategic edge. They build teams that are resilient, that last.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that. So our goal for this deep dive is to walk through the framework presented in these sources. It's about cultivating peace, unity, right from the very beginning. They call it from first hello to spiritual leadership. We're really focusing on how these foundational principles meet practical organizational strategy. So to get us started, we need that anchor point. What's the ultimate goal here? How do the sources define this peace we're aiming for?
Yeah, the anchor is this powerful, ancient concept, shalom. Now, when we hear peace, we often think, quiet, no fighting. But biblically, shalom is much, much bigger. It's relational, it's restorative. Think wholeness, flourishing, relationships being in the right order, and that's across the board. With God, with other people, with yourself, even with creation.
Wow, okay, so that immediately frames reconciliation not just as, like, cleaning up a mess after a fight, but as an active, ongoing thing.
Exactly. It becomes a core function. The sources point to the idea that the gospel itself is about reconciliation, God reconciling us through Christ. And if that's true at the spiritual level, the argument goes it has to flow outwards into how communities live together. Unity becomes the visible proof, almost.
But that brings up a really tough point, the one about justice, right? Because you can have a kind of peace where everyone just agrees not to talk about the difficult stuff, the injustices. That feels fragile.
Oh, absolutely critical. And the source material is very direct on this. It says, unity without justice is brittle. It won't last. Genuine shalom, the kind we're talking about, refuses that kind of superficial peace, the kind that just papers over oppression or ignores unfairness. It demands right relationships. And that includes telling the truth, even when it's hard, and working towards actual restoration. You can't just sweep wrongs under the rug for the sake of appearing unified. If truth gets sacrificed for ease, that unity just shatters under any real pressure.
That definitely sets a high bar. So if shalom is the goal, let's talk about the roadblocks. Why do so many groups, even those founded on these very principles, still end up fracturing? What are the deeper things going on?
Yeah, we need to look past the surface arguments. The sources identify two main, often subtle drivers of division. The first one they call identity collisions. This happens when our secondary identities, and we all have them, right? Political views, cultural background, maybe class, ethnicity, when these start to creep into the core identity of the group. And crucially, they jump the queue, they become primary.
Can you give an example? Make that a bit more concrete.
Sure. Think about maybe sharp disagreements over how people approach public health issues, or maybe specific political affiliations. If arguing about, say, masks or who someone voted for becomes the test of whether you truly belong in that community, well, then that secondary identity has basically shoved aside the primary shared identity, maybe faith in this context. And when that boundary shifts from the core belief to like a cultural or political litmus test, division is almost guaranteed.
That feels incredibly relevant right now. Okay, what's the second driver you mentioned?
It's very closely linked, actually. It's theology reduced to tribe. This is where important doctrinal points, which should be about shaping how we live and grow, get turned into weapons. They become markers of who's in and who's out. The sources call it boundary maintenance. So if disagreements over, let's say, secondary theological issues are treated like tests of loyalty, like tribal warfare, Well, you kill healthy discussion and unity just dissolves. And underneath both of these often is this layer of woundedness and unprocessed conflict,
Yeah.
old hurts that never got healed, just hardening over time into factions.
Okay, so we have the goal shalom and the dangers, these identity collisions of tribal theology. Now we need the how, the practical steps. This framework is meant to be proactive, right? Starting from minute one.
Exactly. It gets very tactical here. It kicks off with seeing hospitality itself as a core spiritual practice.
Right, the section called the first hello, the first, 0 to 90 days.
That's the window. And the focus is designing those first 20 minutes specifically for belonging, not just, getting information or finding a seat. It has to immediately signal that this is about relationship, about care, not just a transaction. The sources get really specific. Train your greeters, your first contact people, to ask two simple but powerful questions.
What brings you and who can we pray for?
Yep. Those exact two. They cut through the usual small talk. They immediately open up a path for connection, signal vulnerability, signal care. It tells the newcomer right away, you're seen here and what's going on with you matters. That first interaction dramatically reduces the chance they just drift away anonymously.
And that connects directly to what's called the welcome to worship pipeline. That sounds like the system for making sure that initial welcome sticks.
It's the integration piece. The whole point is to fight against anonymous attendance. You want to build connection and, frankly, mutual accountability quickly. The source material is pretty firm. Within 60 to 90 days, newcomers should be invited into three key things: a small group, some kind of serving team, and a regular discipleship rhythm. If they just attend the main service or meeting, they stay disconnected, high risk for drifting. Integration means they have people who know their name, expect them, check in on them.
Okay, moving beyond that initial welcome phase. To keep the community healthy, there needs to be a shared way of thinking when conflict does pop up, which it inevitably will. What are the key guiding ideas or axioms the framework suggests?
Two main ones stand out. First, the priority of reconciliation. This means leaders, and really the whole culture, need to operate from the assumption that restoration is possible. It means setting up processes, like maybe taking that Matthew 18 approach seriously, the step-by-step direct conversation, then bringing others in, seeing that as the normal first response, not the last resort.
Just assuming restoration is possible. That changes the whole feel of how you'd approach a conflict.
Completely shifts the posture. The second axiom is humility before certainty. This one is maybe the toughest in today's climate. It's about holding your convictions strongly enough to be faithful, to have discernment, but loosely enough that you can genuinely listen and learn from people who see things differently. It means really trying to live out that kind of selfless, others first ethic you see described in, say, Philippians 2.
Okay, but how do you actually do that? How do you practice humility before certainty in a world that feels so polarized without looking like you don't believe anything or you're compromising on essentials? The sources must touch on that practical tension.
They do, and they root it in shared practices, not just intellectual agreement. The idea is you build the relational glue before the big conflicts erupt. So the framework pushes for regular rhythms, like corporate confession, where leaders actually model owning mistakes, simple things like sharing meals together, table fellowship, and something they specifically highlight, restorative storytelling nights.
Restorative storytelling, what does that look like? What's its purpose?
It's about weaving people together through shared stories and vulnerability. It's a structured time for people to share experiences of maybe brokenness they've walked through, or times they received or gave forgiveness, or how they navigated a really tough disagreement. When you make talking about repair normal, you build a culture where it feels safer to be vulnerable, where admitting fault isn't, the end of the world. Okay, so we've talked about building the culture proactively, but sometimes, despite best efforts, things escalate. So now we need to shift to structured responses for when crises do happen. Because peacemaking isn't just a nice idea, it's a practical skill set. It needs clear, fair protocols that aim for restoration.
Right. So when the proactive stuff isn't enough and tensions are high, how does the organization make sure repair happens in a just way?
The sources lay out a pretty clear three-step process for institutional repair. Step one is early repair. This is basically doubling down on that expectation of immediate, private, direct conversation first, that Matthew 18 style. Encourage it, train people in it. If that doesn't work or isn't appropriate, you move to step two, mediated reconciliation. This isn't just sticking two people in a room. It requires trained, neutral mediators, and it uses specific restorative practices. Things like structured listening sessions, helping people articulate the actual impact of actions, not just feelings, but concrete harm, and importantly, developing clear accountability plans.
Tell me more about that concrete accountability plan. What makes it different from just saying sorry?
Good question. An accountability plan gets specific about behaviors. What needs to stop? What needs to change? How will future interactions be handled differently? It might involve making amends in some tangible way, restitution, or setting up behavioral agreements, maybe check-ins over time to ensure things are improving. It shifts from just, I feel bad, to here's what I will demonstrably do differently.
Okay. And what happens if the issue isn't just between two people, but it's bigger? Like it reflects a systemic problem, a pattern of injustice, or a major policy failure?
That's where step 3, structural remedies, comes in. For those kinds of systemic harms, the framework says you need to establish something like a dedicated restorative justice panel. This panel needs to be diverse, trained. Its job isn't mediating between individuals, but examining the underlying policies, the power dynamics, the structures that allowed the harm to happen. And then they recommend concrete structural changes to prevent it from happening again. It's about addressing the institution itself, not just the incident.
This sounds like it requires a pretty fundamental shift in what we expect from leaders. We're moving beyond just managing tasks and budgets. It's about actively cultivating this peace-focused culture. So, what does the leadership development need to look like to make sure these practices actually stick and can scale up as a movement grows?
Yeah, the focus has to shift from just producing managers to intentionally forming peacemakers. That's the language used. And the sources are pretty insistent on 3 core elements for leadership training. First, explicit teaching on biblical peacemaking skills, how to actually do reconciliation. Second, intense training in power awareness. Understanding how power works, especially unexamined power dynamics, is crucial because those dynamics will fracture movements trying to scale if they're not addressed. And third, genuine cross-cultural competency. You simply can't scale unity across diverse groups if leaders are blind to cultural nuances or power imbalances between different groups.
And if that's what you're training, then how you evaluate leaders has to change too, right? How do you measure if someone is a good peacemaker, not just a good manager?
Exactly. Your evaluation has to include what the sources call relational health metrics. You can't just look at the numbers, attendance, budget, whatever, or just how charismatic they seem. You have to find ways to assess how they handle conflict, how they build bridges, how they foster unity. We need actual data points on this.
Can you give some concrete examples? What kind of relational health metrics should leaders be looking at?
Sure. You can track things like staff or volunteer retention rates on their team's low turnover often signals a healthier culture.
Yeah.
You could measure the average time it takes to resolve conflicts that get formally documented, and maybe even track the frequency and perceived quality of one-on-one check-ins they have with team members. The core idea is if a leader consistently avoids or mishandles the relational side, eventually even their technical competence will suffer because character, that ability to connect, repair, build trust, is really the foundation for leading anything sustainable. So maybe the final piece here is, how do we know if all this effort towards shalom, towards peace, is actually working, beyond just the internal reports or metrics?
Right, that's the real test, isn't it? The credibility test.
It really is. And the answer seems to be moving beyond just numbers and combining quantitative data with qualitative signals. Quantitatively, yeah, look at things like sustained retention, especially in smaller core groups. That shows real connection, not just Sunday morning attendance. Look for diversity in leadership, not just demographics, but our different theological viewpoints genuinely represented and valued. That points to health.
And the qualitative side, the more sort of visible evidence that this culture is real.
That's where you see the fruit, I think. The sources say the true measure is in the stories. Verifiable testimonies of relationships being genuinely restored. Is there a culture where admitting mistakes, confession is actually normalized, not hidden or punished? And then crucially, what's the external reputation? How do people outside the group, neighbors, local officials, other organizations, describe your community? Do they see it as a safe place, a just place, a reliable presence? That outside view is maybe the ultimate validation.
It brings us back to that image used in the sources, the idea of a hand-woven tapestry. It sounds like strategic peacemaking isn't about trying to avoid the knots or the difficult threads. It's more about the patient, careful work of weaving all those different, sometimes clashing threads together into something whole, something strong, something alive. It's really the backbone of any leadership that wants to last.
That captures it perfectly. And it's crucial to remember this work isn't, sentimental. It's not just pragmatism either, just trying to keep things running smoothly. It's described as deep spiritual labor. It takes real grace, real persistence, and honestly, the credibility of any movement, especially one claiming a spiritual basis, hangs on whether it actually lives out this reconciliation in its day-to-day life. When our internal life reflects that repentance, that mutual respect, that willingness to serve each other sacrificially, that itself becomes this powerful living message to the world.
That's a very challenging but necessary call.
It is. So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to take away and consider. What if you started to position your team, your organization, your community, not just to survive the conflicts that will inevitably come, but to actually view every single disagreement, every tension as an intentional opportunity, an opportunity to go deeper in understanding, and in doing so, become a clearer living example of God's reconciling power at work.